welcome to the Kemetic How-To Guide for Egyptian Pagan and Kemetic practitioners. I'm your host, Sharon. Today we're going to do some book reviews, but we're going to do something a little different this time, and instead of reviewing Egyptology books, we're going to actually review some pagan books. Actually, two of them are strictly pagan, and one happens to be a favorite of some Kemetics, and I don't really know why, but let's just dive right in. The Sacred Magic of Ancient Egypt, Spiritual Practice Restored. Sounds rather impressive, doesn't it? And it's by Rosemary Clark. Interesting bit of trivia here. This book was published in 2003. Now, Rosemary Clark started the Temple Harakti in the 1970s. So they've been around for quite a while. They do have a website that you can go to. One of my recommendations from a fellow Kemetic who had read this book and said she found it rather useful. So I said, okay, well, let me try it. And at a point when I had a budget to go and get new books, I got this one. Let me give you the prose of it first. Chapter 2 is titled Esoteric Architecture, and it's very detailed. It goes through and explains layouts in ancient temples and how you could apply these sorts of things in building your own temple space. I would say take some of her assertions with a grain of salt. Because anytime somebody says, oh, well, they're always done, da-da-da-da, and they're always oriented in a specific way, beware of the word always, because the only time when it's true is when you say there are always exceptions. For example, the idea that temples were always oriented north-south or east-west, there were exceptions based on locale, and sometimes they'd be a little bit off because of the land and, how things had to be built. So just, take that with a grain of salt. Another chapter, chapter 4, is titled Theurgy, and it deals with ritual components, different levels of priesthood, and, different things that they would be associated with. Also a very detailed chapter, very interesting reading. The only problem is it's geared more towards a group. If you're a solitary practitioner, then reading something about different levels of priest and what their role would be in a temple would be a little hard to put into practice. So that's something that a lot of pagans have difficulty with, is finding a book that gives information for solitaries. And that's one of the things I try to address in my books, like Following and Circle of the Sun. Chapter 5 is titled Liturgy. And there's stuff taken from sources all over. And it's interesting reading, and it took me a while to kind of parse through it, to read it once and then read it again and figure out, okay, these are rituals determined by season, but they're determined by astrological season, like the season of Pisces, the season of Aries, and so on. It kind of took me a while to figure out, because you're reading a lot of stuff and you're going, okay, this is from, the Book of the Dead or from here or there. And you go, oh, wait, okay, so you're supposed to read all of these and, put it together. So it's not something you can just wait until an hour before ritual, keep a bookmark and then pull it out and then, oh, I know what we're doing. I wouldn't recommend that. But there are some quibbles that I have with this book. The first thing, as I mentioned, astrological seasons. It's based off of the one that we know that was begun by the Babylonians and then used by the Greeks. It didn't come to Egypt until the Ptolemaic period. And so yes, you can go to the Temple of Hathor at Dendera and see a zodiac on the ceiling, but that's because the temple on that site that we have today was built during the Ptolemies, and so there's a little bit of influence from the Greeks by that point. The Egyptians had constellations that represented certain things, but a lot of it we're still trying to figure out, and that's something I'd like to do more research on later. There also, another thing that she does in this book is she divides things up by the 5 elements. That's also something Greek. And that's a topic that we're going to revisit again with another book. For example, Sa, she gives us quintessence. Well, the Egyptians didn't have a concept for that. So, calling this book The Spiritual Practice Restored, well, again, take that with a grain of salt. Restored to when? The last thing that I have to point out with this, of all the most noteworthy quibbles, on page 335, she gives a table of 42 Neteru. They are the imperishable ones. Each one has a cosmic station. There's a point in the heavens that it's associated with. Well, 3 of them are associated with the outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. What, did you think I was going to say Uranus? You're welcome. But here's the problem with that. Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto were not discovered until recently. They are not visible to the naked eye. You have to have either binoculars or a telescope strong enough to view them. And Uranus was not discovered until the late 1700s. Pluto was not discovered until the 1930s by an American astronomer. Take that, Neil deGrasse Tyson. But for our purposes, associating Kepri with Pluto would be impossible if you're trying to say this is an ancient association. A modern one, okay, maybe, but don't try to say this is something restored from ancient times when they didn't know what Pluto was. They couldn't find it in the sky at that point. And even you couldn't unless you had a telescope and some friends that were really into astronomy. So overall, I would say this about sacred magic of ancient Egypt. If you're a Hellenistic pagan with an Egyptian bent, then yeah, get this book, because it does combine all of those elements. If you're very much into Western astrology, yes, get this book, because you'll be able to find ways to weave Egyptian things into that system. And it's obvious. You go to her website and there's a lot of stuff on like the current astrological tables and stuff like that. So that's a definite use for this. And if you're an eclectic pagan and your thing is Egyptian, but you've got other people in your circle or your coven that like doing stuff related to astrology or Greek mythology or whatever, you might want to turn to this for some ideas for things that you can do together with, you know, an eclectic group. However, as I said, don't get this book and say, oh, well, I'll just pull out a ritual, you know, a couple of hours beforehand or, you know, on the day of, and, you know, we'll figure it out. No, this is not one of those pick up and use sort of books. You're going to have to do some thinking and maybe even some scribbling down of, you know, how to adapt things. And as if you're like me and trying to find things that are specific to ancient Egypt without influence from other cultures, also, I would put this one lower on the priority list. I mean, there are a lot of interesting tables in here, and a lot of things like having to do with the deacons that I may refer to myself later. If you're trying to prioritize, put this one a little lower down. That said, on to the next book. By the way, my fellow YouTubers, how do you feel about the changes to YouTube's partnership program and how a lot of us have gotten demonetized? On one hand, yeah, that means fewer ads, but like you can really escape ads and product placements these days. Our second book is Circle of Isis, Ancient Egyptian Magic for Modern Witches, and it is by Ellen Cannon Reed. This book was also published in 2002, but the author began her Egyptian or Tamarin Wiccan practice in the 1970s, which kind of raises the question to me, how long and hard do pagan authors, and especially Egyptian pagan authors, have to look in order to get noticed and get a publisher? Had I not gone through Lulu myself and self-published, I might still be waiting for somebody to pick me up. But fortunately, someone did pick up Ellen Cannon Reed, and this is a very interesting book. On the plus side, she spends part one talking about different deities and giving personal experiences for a lot of them. And I have to say, a lot of them do have a strong ring of truth, especially when she talks about Osiris and Isis, Tahuti, her description of Ra. As I was reading this, I was going, yep, this sounds right. I can tell this is legitimate work that she and her coven have done. And there's some other things in part two, which gets into more of the nitty-gritty, you know, how-to, that are very good. She describes a mantra meditation that you can do and a contact ritual for how to work with deities that I would say, yes, they're very good. I would recommend using those. The guided meditation I'll get to in a minute. But she also has things like songs for the gods, recipes. Her list of amulets is pretty decent. A lot of things in here that seem like they'd be worth looking at and trying. On the downside, as I just mentioned, she has guided meditations for different deities in here. And this is not so much a quibble with her as it is with a lot of pagans. I've been to some Wiccan circle, Sabbats where we did what was supposed to be a guided meditation, and really it turns into a reading exercise. Because you've got this long thing that somebody has to read. So they're not going to get to do any kind of meditation. They're busy reading that. And it's too specific, and you end up going on an imaginary trip to their words and not really getting a chance to envision in your own mind the deity that's being talked about, the concept, going through the seasons, whatever. And so this is kind of a problem that I have with participating with some Wiccan practices. You have that in this book as well. Their view of Anapu, in particular, in his guided meditation, that's something that works for them. That's how they see him, but it doesn't quite sync up 100% with descriptions that other folks who are devotees of Anubis have described. Also, the further you go into the list of deities, some of them, it's obvious they hadn't worked with them. They were pulling them from Budge, for one example. I think some of them were put in there for the sake of completeness. So, I would rather see a shorter list that is just the ones that you've worked with, rather than try and go through, a list that may or may not be up to date and mention some of these other deities. But then again, because they were working with another publisher, maybe the publisher wanted to see that. Who knows? Another drawback to this book is there is no complete Wheel of the Year described in it. She does have a very interesting ritual for Bast. There isn't a Wheel of the Year that gives you Lithin, Beltane, Samhain, so on, and I know I'm not doing those in order, but you get the idea. She does have a how-to on making your own sistrum, kilt, and nemes. I'll admit I'm a little biased. I think mine are better, but, her instructions might work better for somebody else. Who knows? Overall, what would I say about this book? I would say that I like it in spite of the inaccuracies that are in it. Because it's obvious that they work with these deities, they have some experience that they're talking about, and she does give you plenty that you can start from. And also, for the things that it lacks, I'm perfectly content to let this book dovetail with mine, because in the updated edition of Following the Sun, I do give you a Wheel of the Year. Part of the reason for that was because I noticed that this book didn't have one. So if you're thinking about getting this book, go ahead, stick it on the shelf next to mine. It's got plenty to work from, but what it lacks, you can make up for with other books. Consider it part of a whole. And now our last book, Temple of the Cosmos, The Ancient Egyptian Experience of the Sacred. This is not a pagan book. The author is not pagan. He is a philosopher. And for whatever reason, this book seems to be really popular with Kemetics. And when I went on Amazon and read part of it through the preview, what I could read through the preview seemed okay. So, again, I had a budget at that point. I said, alright, let me get it. And in short, this book made me crazy. I hated it. But for you, my viewers, I went through it again just so that I could be specific in what I have to say about this book. Let's go. Chapter 1 is a metaphysical landscape. And it starts off pretty good. He's describing the countryside of Egypt, the river and the desert, the significance of each and how it figures in their religion and their mythology. Okay, good start. Then we get to Chapter 2, Interpenetrating Worlds. And this is where it starts to go cray-cray. For one, he starts describing Geb, the earth god, as weak and passive. And I'm going, where are you getting that? Where are you supporting that contention? Geb, the god of the earth, okay, the foundation of kingship, his laughter is earthquakes. And you're saying he's weak and passive? Huh? But then he goes on to give an idea of Geb and Shu and Nut as being matter, spirit, and soul. And, these three divisions, that's not native to Egyptian thinking. That is coming from Greek thinking. See, when I first read this book, I was fresh out of a philosophy class. And it was ethics of philosophy. Now, if you study Western philosophy, you are studying something that is based on Greek thought. And they tell you that. They start off talking with Socrates and then go into Plato. and Aristotle, and the difference between Platonic thinking and Aristotelian thinking. Aristotle was the founder of, what is now our scientific method. Plato gave us the idea of the physical world and then a perfect spiritual world that was separate from it. That all goes back to Platonic thinking, and this pervades the entire book here. That is not native to Egyptian thinking. Well, alright. I'm making myself go further along. Chapter 5, The Marriage of Myth and History. This is where he goes off the freaking rails. Because he starts off describing time through the concept of Zep-Tepi, and really, the way he's trying to describe the Egyptian concept of time. A better book to explain that would actually be The Search for God in Ancient Egypt by Jan Assmann, translated by David Lorton. This would really be a better book to explain the Egyptian concepts of time, cyclical versus linear, than this one. But then, what really made me go, with this book is he goes on to claim that the Egyptians recorded their annals of kings, the lists of kings' reigns, and tailored the records to match stellar cycles of the Decans and the star Sirius, also called the Sothic cycle, and that this marriage of the cosmic cycle with historical fact was more important than what we would consider accurate historical fact. And I'm going, wait a minute now. I can imagine a whole bunch of scribes in ancient Egypt who had to record administrative processes for the kings, wanting to tear their hair out. Not to mention 200 years worth of Egyptologists who found nothing to support what this guy is claiming. We've found plenty of other records that deal with the years of a king's reign, and we've even had to adjust some of them over time. But nowhere is there any suggestion that they matched all of this up to a greater cycle having to do with the precession of the Decans and the star Sirius. Another thing that he goes on to say is that he claims the Palermo stone, which is a record on stone from the Old Kingdom, and he says that this list in the Palermo stone only records cosmic events. BS! I've read a translation of the Palermo stone. There's also records of cattle censuses that were done, battles that were fought, and grants that were given to temples, which were an administrative function. Okay, so this gets into another problem that is not just limited to this book, but this book seems to be stricken with it. And that is this idea that Egypt was this rosy place that was very mystical, and it was filled with priests and people who were psychically in tune with everything, and it just doesn't match reality. Look, I love ancient Egypt, warts and all. I want to read about the temple servants that went to a mud brick home and slept on a dirt floor, not just these beautiful, well-groomed priests that lived with their heads in the clouds, which wasn't really true anyway. The rest of this book goes on to try to interpret underworld texts as a psychic journey, and then goes on to claim that the scenes we depict as the weighing of the heart was actually supposed to represent a state of balance where you've achieved ma'at, or balance between opposing forces within your nature. And that was when you became a self-actualized soul. And by this point, I just wanted to eat the book, okay? Don't even bother with it, alright? Don't. If you really want to understand Egyptian concepts like their sense of time, the dual nature of time, the components of the person, creation, and the symbolic meaning of the different deities, all of that stuff, go for The Search for God in Ancient Egypt by Jan Assmann, or his other book, Death and Salvation in Ancient Egypt by Jan Assmann, also translated by David Lorton. Both of these books, this one's pretty thick. The other one, if you can get through Temple of the Cosmos, you can get through this one. And this is a better book. What's interesting about this is, whereas the two pagan books that I described both had a problem with using outdated sources, being books published by Budge, despite having outdated sources, there was some genuine faith in what they wrote. And so you could tell they were at least pointing in the right direction. Whereas this guy is using some more recent research and still manages to go off into crazy town. What's even crazier about it is this guy says, it's specifically stated in part of this book, that he doesn't believe the Egyptian religion needs to be recreated. So guys, Kemetic Reconstructionists, why are you reading his book? He doesn't even want you doing what you're doing. Save your money. Get the other ones by Jan Osman. You'll be better off. Hopefully, this will help you be a more informed consumer of Egyptian pagan books. And there's more books coming up all the time. Lately, there have been a lot of them that have been anthologies of hymns to Sekhmet and to Bast, and things like that. I'd love to be able to review some more. Of course, those are newer books. They cost a little bit more to get sometimes. That's why I'm doing these reviews, because I want you to be able to choose where best to spend your money. If you've got a book that you want reviewed and you want to just send it to me, loan me or something, message me and we can talk about that. But in the meantime, for the Kemetic How-To Guide, this is Sharon, wishing you Senepti. Enjoyed this video? Then be sure to hit like and subscribe to the Kemetic Independent channel. You can also buy my books on lulu.com, shop handmade pagan supplies in my Etsy store, and get your official Kemetic Independent gear on Zazzle. Go ahead and hit pause for the links. You can even rewind and watch this video again.